first thing I want to do is think back the last time I experienced a revolution and to report to you how wrong everybody was. And this was November 1989. There had been in the previous 6 months sort of conferences all over the world celebrating 40 years of Germany. Germany's constitution was 1949. And the last conference was at Harvard. It was sort of the biggest party of it all. That was in October. I think October 20th or something. And while there had been stirrings of change, you know, the Iron Curtain had come down between Hungary and Austria, and in Poland there was clearly things happening. Nobody, but nobody, foresaw what was going to happen in the next 2 months. And with one possible exception. And there was Charlie Mayer, a historian, who said, well, if things change, they'll change in a hurry. It will be like 1848. And that was the closest thing to capturing what was going to happen between November and the end of December. And then, of course, there was the Chancellor of Germany in January saying, yes, these are momentous changes. Now the wall had fallen, and Germany is on the path to unification. And it will take 10 to 15 years. Now, I can say many things about Kohl. He was a very astute politician. He had his finger on the pulse. Well, he was off by 9.5 years. So neither scholars nor activists or politicians had a clue what was happening. And I think we are at the beginning of a moment in the Middle East. It may turn out that this will be a form of arrested development, that the civil war in Libya will stop things, that the Algerian model will prevail. It may be that we will wake up tomorrow and Saudi Arabia will be aflame. We have no idea. All we know is that in the middle or at the beginning of a revolution, social sciences are not science. Things have a logic of their own. And we are in that moment of world history. So I believe that the events in Tunisia and Egypt, possibly Bahrain, now the war in Libya, and daily demonstrations in Iraq and all over are of fundamental importance. I don't know what they mean, but as I sit here and think about it, the deeply puzzling thing for me is that the basic structure of world politics and of American domestic politics seems to me not affected by it. Yet the open-endedness of the political future has no limit. And this is a great baffling thing to me. In 1989, the structure of world politics seemed to change. I lost a big bet on German unification. But I won back the case of wine, which I lost, by making a bet in December of 1989. I said the Soviet Union would not exist 2 years later. Because at that time, it was clear to me, if the Soviet Union let the GDR go, that that empire would unravel in a hurry. So at least I didn't lose that much money. But I wouldn't be able to wager a bet of where we will be 2 years from now in the Middle East. Even though I have a sense of a structure of politics in the world and in America, which seems to be not affected by this. And this, for the social scientists and me, is if the structure is not really affected, there ought to be something I could see about the political future, but I can't. So it's that message which I want to deliver under 2 headings. I will talk about a world of regions, because I do believe that this is an event which confirms the analysis of the world as one constituted by regions, and the regional religious basis of American domestic politics. Those are the 2 big points, and I will end up with a brief set of conjectures about how one could think about what's happening in the Middle East now compared to other revolutionary moments and changes in the last 30 years, and whether they're open or not. I have nothing to say about what this means for the Middle East, and I'm not sure about the format here. I will try to talk briefly, so if there's discussion, I'd love to have reactions. So let me turn to the first point, that the structure of world politics is a world of regions, and that this seems to be confirmed by the events of recent weeks. Now, saying that it's a world of region doesn't mean that it is not occurring in an overall umbrella. It is occurring in an overall umbrella, which is what Avi's book is all about. It is occurring under the umbrella of what I call an American imperium. That is a structure of politics which is not just the structure of military and economic capabilities, which would be an empire with a small e, but also the structure of politics of an empire of ideas and ideologies, deeply attractive, which would be an empire with a capital E. And imperium, as for the Roman imperium, is a combination of both kinds of structures. America is not just boots on the ground. America is not just popular culture or religion. It is a mixture of these things. And this imperium provides the umbrella in which a world of region has grown up in the last 50 years under the American auspices. Now, compared to the British and Soviet empires and imperiums, this one was different. Compared to Britain, 4 of the 6 centers of power in the world were part of the imperium. Only the Soviet Union, and now Russia, and China were not part of it. And that has not been affected. One can even see it now, with the Chinese sending their navy offshore to Libya. This is a rather remarkable thing to watch, okay, to make sure the evacuation runs. And of course, Russia being very opposed to the no-fly zone over Libya. By the way, Russia is there in firm alliance with the Secretary of Defense of the United States, who made a rather remarkable speech about 2 weeks ago, in which he said any American Secretary of Defense who would advise his president in the next 30 years to put ground troops into any part of the world ought to have his head examined. This was in anticipation of the debates which are likely to come in the next several months. So compared to Britain was an offshore power of Europe. It did not control the major powers. It controlled most of the world, but not the center of the world. And compared to the Soviet Union, the American imperium controlled or was present in all parts of the world. It wasn't just present in the adjacent areas. The Soviet Empire always was a defensive empire. So the imperium, as an overall structure, provides, the context in which this world of regions exists. Now, that view of the world, an imperium in which these regions are nested, differs quite substantially from 2 very common tropes in which the world is characterized. One, the world of globalization, and the world of internationalization. Globalization is a world normally described and analyzed by sociologists, and it is about the connection between the global and the local. Internationalization is normally the concept which political science economists use, and it's the relationship between different units. I don't think that these views are wrong. Globalization and internationalization clearly exist, and they create these regions not of the kind which would be self-contained blocks. Think of, Nazi Germany and Japan in the 1930s, creating regional orders under the control of Germany or Japan. Those were self-contained autarkic regions. The world of regions now looks like a Swiss cheese, mostly wholes, okay? Wholes created by processes of internationalization, globalization, but also of regionalization. So the concept of territoriality, which still matters a great deal, is being eroded or complemented by other flows of goods, ideas, things, which make territoriality to some extent less important. So if this is the structure of world politics, then how do these regions relate to the American imperium? Well, 2 of them were considered to be really important. And there was a rather remarkable act of foresight in the 1940s by George Kennan in a famous long cable which he sent anonymously in 1947, in which he said, the structure of the world, 1947, was in the middle of the fog. Nobody knew what the world was like. I mean, I have to read that cable against the complete ignorance of everybody else. And he said the structure of the world will be a combination of Western Europe and East Asia, the rimlands of that Eurasian landmass, which geopoliticians had theorized about for 100 years. Those two rimlands need to be protected and part of the United States imperium. If that works, then we will be in a long fencing match with the Soviet Union, and eventually we will win. Now, the problem was it meant integrating into this coalition of the rimlands Germany and Japan, that is the two arch enemies of liberal democracy. And that was a big fight, and that fight was won, and then the structure of that view of the world prevailed for American foreign policy, unquestioned so, until 1989. So Europe, Western Europe and East Asia had a special position. The American interest was really high, and they never let go of this. And then there was a third region, which had, for different reasons, a similar strategic interest, and that was the Middle East. And that was not because of Israel, that was because of oil. But eventually, starting, let's say, in 1967 or whatever, Israel became more and more important. Okay? Those were the three key regions. Africa was the opposite. Africa did not matter. Africa was left to France, and to some extent, French influence trying to combat Soviet influence. And the reason that anti-Americanism in Africa is so low is that they have the French to hate. So now that France has begun to remove itself from Africa over the last 15 years, and the Americans are worried about failing states in Africa and are now revising their defense strategy to create what they call lily pads, that is points of intervention if they want to need them in the war on terror, anti-Americanism in Africa will obviously rise. That's going to obviously happen. But over most of the last half century, Africa didn't matter. And Latin America and South Asia were sort of in the in-between position. So to come to the end point of this first point, the Middle East has always been strategic in this world of region. And the fact that you had from this one food cart vendor in Tunisia, confirming, by the way, Mahatma Gandhi's dictum that any individual can shape world history. Okay? His suicide creates a region-wide reverberation and just shows that the Middle East, heterogeneous as it is, has a regional logic of its own. So I think the events confirm that this is still true. And if the revolution were to affect not just Egypt, but in particular Saudi Arabia, this would have profound consequences of making the Middle East even more important to American foreign policy. So let me then turn to the second point, which is probably less well known, but important. That is the role of regions and religion in American domestic politics. Most of you know that we paint America in two colors, red and blue. Red states and blue states. If you ask yourself, where does this come from? Well, it sort of starts when I first arrived in the United States. In 1964, there was the Republican Barry Goldwater, and he got swamped. He was too conservative. And then in 1972, there was McGovern. He was a blue candidate, and he did carry Massachusetts. So those were the two extremes. And what happened in the next decade or so was a shift. And the shift occurred in the South. And the South, in my reading of American domestic politics, has been the pivotal region. It has all pivoted always around the South. American liberal interventionism of the last half century until the 1980s was an unholy alliance between the Democratic Party liberals in the Northeast, and the Democratic Party, racists in the South. And the deal was, you liberals can have your liberal interventionism abroad as long as you permit segregation in the South. Lyndon Johnson, to his credit, said, I'm going to break that bargain. And he also said, through the civil rights legislation, and he also said, I know by breaking the bargain, I will eliminate the structural majority of the Democrats in American politics. And that is exactly what happened. So liberalism and racism in American politics have been close cousins, which is something which liberals don't like to talk about, but it's a fact. And of course, it has a long ancestry because Woodrow Wilson was a racist. I mean, he was a racist, he was a man of the South, and therefore was always opposed to Reconstruction, and he was a racist when it came to the Treaty of Versailles. The racial equality clause was vetoed by Woodrow Wilson. So when you read the books on American foreign policy, well, very, very rarely will you find out that Woodrow Wilson was a racist. This does not sit very well in the American understanding of what liberalism is. But when I go and lecture in East Asia, and I say, Woodrow Wilson, they say, oh yes, Woodrow Wilson, we remember him. Wasn't he the racist? They don't regard him as a liberal. Okay? So what has happened in the last generation is a polarization due to a new coalition in American politics. And it is a polarization which has made the traditional class division largely irrelevant. Over the last 30 years, inequality in America has increased enormously. The deep resentment, which you can feel and hear in everyday life in America now, directed against the banks and reflecting an increase of the unemployment rate of more than 7 million, is class politics which cannot be articulated. Instead, cultural politics has taken over. And we hear about this in terms of the fights about multiculturalism, but I actually think it has a lot more to do with religion. It is a shift of the Southern evangelicals from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in what's called the Third Awakening, the third religious great revivalism in American history since the Declaration of Independence. That has shifted the tectonic plates of American domestic politics. And this is of profound consequences, as you will clearly discuss today, for the relationship between Israel and the United States. Religion has a lot to do with a re-cementing of these relationships, which would be questioned by secularists, saying, Mersheim and Wald, writing their book about the Israel lobby, do not pay much attention to religion. I don't think they're very much in tune with American domestic politics. So I think the shift of these Episcopalians has a lot to do with it because it shifts about a quarter of the American electorate to a fervent support of Israel. So that is the core of the regional realignment in American domestic politics. Now, both the blue states and the red states, and I'm now coming to the issue of nationalism, are nationalists. And their nationalists, American nationalism, to me as an ex-German, is exceptionally strong. Germans, of course, have lost their nationalism. They submerged it into Europeanism. And exceptionally pervasive. You see it in the shopping malls, you see it on July 4th, you see it in the flag parades, you see it in everyday rhetoric. Everyday rhetoric which extols American exceptionalism and how this insistence on the city of the shining city on the hill, how it's intertwined with a fervent belief in religion and the Constitution. In that sense, there also is a parallelism to Israel. That is, the Constitution is become a document of a civil religion, in the sense that it's being interpreted as a fundamental text, mostly in the legal profession, in particular the Supreme Court, but it is being invoked as a religious text. So that the secular part of America with its secular nationalism, has a foundational text to which it appeals and which it holds dear, which I can only call with religious convictions. So what about the civic nationalism? Well, it's organized around the American creed. And the American creed is rationalist and universal. It's grounded in the Enlightenment, and it talks about liberty, constitutionalism, law, human rights, democracy, and all the good things in life. It does not talk about economic equality. It only talks about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And of course it talks about, and in still controversial terms, that it's controversial that it's being debated actively, about racial and gender equality. So the creed has to be, if you're an American, you have to subscribe to the creed. To reject any part of it would make you un-American. Un-American in the sense of McCarthy in the mid-1950s. So this sense of debating aspects of the creed, a debate which you could have in France and have had in France in the last decade, you cannot have in America. So in that sense, America is the most ideological of all societies. It's not the most ideological state, it's the most ideological society. And you can see why. Given the heterogeneity of this society, just think of the gay rights movement in San Francisco, living under the same political regimes as Pentecostalism in southern Texas, you have to have a strong ideology to hold that society together. And of course, one of the great virtues of this very strong ideological creed was the ability to assimilate immigration on a huge scale. Not in the last decade. I mean, in the last 10, 20 years, Europe has absorbed as many people as has the United States, but of course less successfully, because Europe as a polity doesn't have this strong, fervent civic nationalism. But this is only one kind of nationalism. The second one is the ethno-religious nationalism. It too is deep. There was either me or a fire alarm, okay? It too has deep American roots, and I would call it the nativism of the white population. Particular ethno-religious nationalism is strong in the white South. And of course very pronounced in the ethnic lobbies. Its core is the white Protestant America, which sees its civilization under attack by a world which America helped create. That is the world of open borders, which follows from America's imperium, is the one which this part of America resents and is hostile to. Now, this ethno-religious nationalism has different elements, and I don't want to go into them. You know, the original core was white Anglo-Saxonism and Scots. The specific experience of the Civil War and its aftermath in the South, fundamentalist Protestantism, which has risen in enormous importance, not just in the United States, but globally, and then the particular fears of particular ethnic lobbies. Now, these two nationalisms, civic and ethno-religious, create tension and conflict in America, but they also reinforce each other. And right now in America, since the American imperium, I don't think it has been hollowed out yet, but it clearly has been weakened by the financial crisis of the last 2 or 3 years, and this weakening is going to continue and will constrain what America can or will do in the Middle East for sure. This economic crisis is enhancing once again the demands for class politics. Right now you can see it in Wisconsin and in this movement of eliminating collective bargaining for public sector unions. And while the rollback is justified in terms of the deficits of the states, but it really is not related to the deficits, it's related to power. And while the Republicans may win the first round, there will be many rounds, and the unions will become mobilized in a way in which they have not in a generation. And the American public, by what I sense, is not for this. I think the Republicans are making a mistake. But it's one manifestation that class politics of a new kind is rising and will undermine or transform these two nationalisms. The hate of Obama and the hate of Bush the Younger are personifications of the conflicts which these two forms of nationalism have for each other. And the country in electoral terms is basically divided half and half. In that sense, not very different from Israel. We have a different electoral system, therefore we can come to majorities, but Obama was not elected in a landslide. Obama was elected with a majority of 4%. It was a 52-48 split, and the 4%, he was behind by 4% until the bank failure of Lehman Brothers. There was a switch by 4%, and he held that majority. Otherwise, we would be counting votes, I think, in Indiana and Ohio still. It would have been a hung election. Right? So Obama didn't have a mandate from the left. Obama seemed to have a mandate from the left because conservative Democrats were elected in large numbers to the Senate. And that Senate majority is going to be gone within 2 years. The next Senate will be a Republican. So just as the Democrats overreached after 2008, so I would expect the Republicans to do it. Every sign points to that now. And so these victories of one side or the other will be temporary. But the hate, saying that George Bush is an evil man, or everything bad in the world is due to George Bush, or the same for Obama, the personification is a reflection of the structure of American domestic politics. Let me come to the conjectures. So if I look at the Middle East now, I say, where are in the last 20 or 30 years comparable cases? Well, clearly, Eastern Europe, the revolution in Eastern Europe, 1989 is one. It had the same sort of brush fire characteristic. It went from Poland and Hungary slow to Germany, East Germany, mass mobilization for 6 weeks, then to Prague, and then in Bucharest, it was basically 10 days. And in Bucharest, Ceausescu, was calling in the coal miners. He was trying to do what Gaddafi is doing. He lost out. They put him into a tank. They drove him around the countryside for a week or 10 days, and then they shot him. And it all happened within, the rapid part happened within 2 months. So there would be one. But if you look at Central Asia, of course, they went through their democratic revolution, but it didn't change the nature of the regime. That is, the autocracy prevailed. And that might well be an outcome for Egypt. That Egypt will look like Kazakhstan. The Egyptian army will be there, it's fully implanted in the economy. The different clientelistic networks, patronage networks, are disrupted by the regime transition at the top. Then they're rebuilt, and the electoral mechanism is finessed. That is, election monitoring will be invited in, but in fact the elections are rigged, and you will get a Central Asian outcome. That's quite possible. Think about Latin America, which went from democracy to military rule to democracy within 25 years, between the 1960s and late 1980s. It could be regime succession of that kind. Think of Turkey. That is a civil-military relationship which made it possible for the military to define a line in the sand which could not be crossed for about 25 years. And the military would say, we are stepping in and seizing power from civilian authorities when that line is being crossed. Okay? And then the military stepped back for good, I believe, largely because Turkey was waging its bet with Europe. And you could not become a member or so stay, basically engage the enlargement of the European Union if you had a military in power. And that disarmed the military and changed the nature of the regime, and then you got Erdogan. That's a possibility. Think about Indonesia. I find in the few talks I've had so far that Indonesia does not register high on the scale. Indonesia in 1997 had lived under Suharto's clan and familial structure of rule for 30 years. It was deeply corrupt. the military was central. And when Suharto was eliminated, people said, well, this cannot lead to a democracy. This is impossible. Well, those people were proven wrong. Indonesia became a stable democracy within 2 years. There had been no organized political life. So Indonesia could be an outcome for Egypt. And of course, we don't know yet how the civil war in Libya will turn out and what the long-term consequences will be for Iran. I'm pretty sure a democratic Middle East is not a region Iran would like. So if you look at these comparisons of different patterns, you know, the best I think that you can do as a social scientist at this point is what I would call pattern recognition. Which pattern seems to be a plausible one for what is happening? And the one which strikes me right now as most plausible, and the different outcomes, would be the Central Asian one for Egypt or the Indonesian one. And what it will mean for American foreign policy and for Israel and Palestine is largely open. But for American foreign policy, I think one thing is for sure. Whether it's Bush or Obama, democracy is constitutive of American identity. It doesn't really mean who's going to be in power. Supporting democracy is deeply part of American foreign policy. It will happen because it is a validation of self. So even if democratization leads to great predicaments, the electoral victory of Hamas, for example, in the end, Americans will choose in their foreign policy democracy. And right now, as of yesterday's news, they're saying, well, in the Gulf states, we are not for democracy necessary, but organized regime transition and modernization. Well, in a revolution, this is what conservative powers, especially imperial ones, will counsel. But they're not in control. In revolutionary moments, the street is in control. So my hunch is that America will rise to this regional revolt and democratization movement with arms only if Saudi Arabia falls. Because, well, Americans don't want to admit it, oil is important. And American elites are very aware of it and are quite open and blunt about it. Liberals don't like to mention it, but they know it. That would be a condition under which I think you might see military intervention. I don't think military intervention otherwise. So what I've tried to do is argue that the regional structure of the world seems to me not affected but rather confirmed by what is happening in the Middle East. The regional structure infused by religion in American domestic politics is not invalidated. In fact, I think these electoral alliances are likely to last, and America will be on a seesaw, blue and red, maybe in succession. America will support democratization, and it will support Israel. It's not just the religious vote, it is the purely pragmatic, for Obama and any presidential candidate, pragmatic consideration that if you want to become president of the United States, you cannot write off Florida, New York State, and California, which any anti-Israel policy would lead to. So in that sense, Israel is not just in the Middle East, Israel is the 51st state of the Union. And every American politician knows this. At the same time, the other close ally of the United States, Saudi Arabia, is a feudal regime, probably the only large feudal regime left in world politics. These are two very unusual allies. A wave of democratization in the Middle East will clearly bring the Middle East into more normal contours for American politics. But what the effects will be for Israeli-American relations, which is the subject of Avi's book, I think is very important to ponder. But if the professors here tell you that they know what will happen, I'll tell you they're wrong. Thank you.